The throne room of Cathara had not been this silent in 100 years. Every noble, every general, every advisor who had clawed and politicked their way into a seat of influence stood frozen in place, watching the doors. Because walking through them, flanked by 12 armored wolves bearing the sigil of a kingdom no one in this room had ever heard of, was a woman wearing a crown. Not just any crown, a circlet of black iron and white stone that pulsed with old magic, the kind that made the air taste like copper and made every wolf in the room instinctively lower their eyes. And not just any woman. Thessaly Vane, the maid, the nobody, the girl who had scrubbed King Caeldraven's floors on her hands and knees 7 years ago, and then vanished in the middle of the night without a trace. She was supposed to be dead. Half the kingdom assumed it. The other half had forgotten she existed at all. But here she was, alive, changed beyond recognition, and walking toward the throne like she had been born to it. Her dark hair was longer now, braided with threads of silver wire. Her posture was straight, her chin lifted, her gaze fixed ahead with the calm, practiced stillness of someone who had learned authority the hard way. Caeldraven sat on the obsidian throne at the far end of the hall, and for the first time in 7 years he could not move. His hands gripped the armrests. His knuckles had gone white. His chest had locked around a breath he could not release because the bond, the one he had spent 7 years trying to bury, trying to starve, trying to burn out of himself with war and silence and sleepless nights, roared back to life in his chest like it had never left. She was alive. She was here. She was wearing someone else's crown. The woman who reached the foot of his throne was not the trembling servant girl he remembered. She looked up at him, and her brown eyes, the same ones that had once watched him from across the room with quiet, aching devotion, were steady, guarded, and utterly unreadable. "Your Majesty," Thessaly said. Her voice did not waver. "I come as an emissary of the Valheim sovereignty. I believe we have matters to discuss." The court erupted into noise. Voices overlapped. Chairs scraped against stone. Someone called for the guard. But Cale heard none of it. Because 7 years ago, he had made the worst mistake of his life. And now it was standing 10 feet in front of him, dressed in iron and authority, looking at him like he was a stranger. This is how it ends. But to understand the ending, you need to know how it started. And it started the way these things always do. Quietly, invisibly, with a girl on her knees, scrubbing a floor she was never meant to walk across. 8 years earlier. Thessaly Vane had been cleaning the Alpha King's private chambers since she was 16. 4 years of the same routine. Arrive before dawn, light the fire, sweep the hearth, scrub the stone floors until they gleamed, change the linens, replace the candles, leave before he returned. Never be seen, never be heard, never leave a trace except the faint smell of soap and cedar polish. She was good at being invisible. She had spent her entire life perfecting it. Thessaly was a foundling, left at the service gate of Cathara's lower keep as an infant, wrapped in undyed cloth with no note, no name, no explanation. The head housekeeper at the time, a stout woman named Odella, had taken her in, given her a name pulled from an old book of Southern saints, and put her to work the moment she was old enough to hold a broom. She had no family, no pack, no bloodline anyone could trace. In a world where lineage determined everything, from your rank to your mating prospects, to whether anyone bothered to learn your name, Thessaly was nothing. A ghost with a dust cloth. And she had made peace with that. Mostly. The king's chambers were the largest rooms in the upper keep, vaulted stone ceilings, tall, narrow windows that let in blades of cold morning light. A massive canopied bed she had to climb a step stool to make. Weapons mounted on every wall. Swords and shields and a longbow made of ash wood that she was terrified to touch because it probably cost more than her entire life was worth. She worked quickly and quietly, the way she always did, hands moving on instinct while her mind wandered. That morning, she was thinking about lavender. Specifically, the wild lavender that grew along the south wall of the herb garden, which she had been drying in small bunches and tucking beneath the king's pillows for the past 3 months. It was a small thing, harmless. Lavender aided sleep, and the king, by all accounts, did not sleep well. She had never spoken to him, had never been in the same room as him while he was conscious, but she noticed things. The way the sheets were always twisted and damp with sweat when she arrived. The way the candles burned down to nothing, suggesting he stayed up most of the night. The way the bed sometimes looked like it had not been slept in at all. So she had started leaving lavender. A tiny, invisible kindness from a tiny, invisible person. She was tucking a fresh sprig beneath the second pillow when the door opened. Thessaly froze. Her hand was still under the pillow. Her heart slammed against her ribs so hard she could feel it in her teeth. He was not supposed to be here. He was never here at this hour. His morning sparring sessions ran until well past dawn, and she always timed her work around his absence. But King Cale Draven stood in the doorway, breathing hard, his sparring leathers still damp with sweat, a cut above his left eyebrow leaking a thin line of blood down his temple. He had come back early. He looked at her. Thessaly had seen the king from a distance dozens of times, across courtyards, through windows, from behind pillars during feast days when the servants lined the walls and pretended not to exist. But up close, 5 feet away, with his gray-green eyes locked directly onto hers, he was something else entirely. Tall enough that she had to tilt her head back. Broad enough to fill the doorframe. A jaw cut from granite, dark hair pushed back from his face, and a stillness about him that felt less like calm and more like a predator deciding whether to strike. "Who are you?" he asked. His voice was lower than she expected. Quieter. It rolled through the room like distant thunder. "Thessaly, Your Majesty," she managed. Her voice came out thin and reedy, barely above a whisper. "I clean your chambers." His gaze dropped to her hand, still frozen beneath his pillow. "What are you doing?" She pulled the lavender sprig free and held it up with trembling fingers. "Lavender, sire. It helps with sleep." I noticed you might. I am so sorry." Something shifted in his expression. Not anger, not exactly. More like confusion, a faint crease between his brows as he looked at the small purple sprig in her shaking hand. "You have been leaving those," he said. It was not a question. Thessaly wanted the floor to swallow her. "Yes, Your Majesty, for about 3 months. I will stop immediately. I overstepped, and I am deeply sorry." She moved toward the door, keeping her head low, her shoulders hunched, making herself as small as possible. But as she passed him, he spoke again. "It helped." Thessaly stopped. She turned slowly, certain she had misheard. Cale was not looking at her. His gaze was on the pillow, on the small indent where the lavender had been. His jaw was tight, and the muscle beneath his ear jumped once. "The lavender," he said. "It helped. Do not stop." Then he walked past her, pulled the door wider, and waited for her to leave. Thessaly fled down the corridor on legs that barely held her upright, her pulse roaring in her ears, the lavender sprig crushed in her fist. She did not stop leaving it. And the next morning, when she arrived at his chambers at the usual hour, there was a small bundle of dried rosemary sitting on the windowsill, tied with a strip of leather, left where only she would find it. She stared at it for a long time. Then she tucked it into her apron pocket and did not tell a soul. The rosemary was the beginning. Not of anything either of them acknowledged. Not of anything anyone else could see. But something had shifted between Thessaly Vane and King Cale Draven, a current running beneath the surface, invisible and undeniable. She continued her work, arrived before dawn, cleaned his chambers, left before he returned. But now there were traces of him meant for her. A bundle of dried mint one morning, a small jar of honey the next, left beside a note in sharp, angular handwriting that read simply, "For your cough." She had been fighting a cold for days and had told no one. He noticed her. That thought alone was enough to keep her awake at night, staring at the ceiling of the narrow room she shared with two other servants, pressing her hand against the ache in her chest. She started noticing him back, not from a distance anymore, but in the details he left behind. The books open on his desk, histories of border conflicts and old treaties, dry reading that suggested a man who took his responsibilities seriously. The way his clothes were always folded precisely on the chair, never thrown carelessly. The half-finished letters he sometimes left out, their language careful and measured, never cruel. He was not what the rumors said. The court called him cold, ruthless. A king forged in war who had buried his capacity for softness somewhere on the battlefield. But the man who left honey for a servant's cough was not cold. He was just careful about where he placed his warmth. 3 weeks after the lavender incident, Thessaly arrived at his chambers and found him there again. This time, he was sitting at his desk, fully dressed, clearly not having slept. Dark circles carved beneath his eyes, a stack of reports in front of him, untouched. He was staring at the far wall with the vacant, unfocused look of a man who had been awake for far too long. Thessaly hesitated in the doorway. "Your Majesty, I can return later." "No," he said without turning. "Do your work." So she did. She swept the hearth. She straightened the bed that clearly had not been used. She moved through the room with practiced quiet, acutely aware of him sitting 6 feet away. The silence between them was strange. Not uncomfortable, not exactly. It was the silence of two people sharing a space who had no reason to speak and every reason to pretend the other did not exist. But Thessaly could feel his exhaustion from across the room. It radiated off him like heat, a bone-deep weariness that had nothing to do with the hour and everything to do with something she could not name. "When did you last sleep, Your Majesty?" she asked before she could stop herself. The words hung in the air. She immediately wished she could claw them back out of existence. Cale turned to look at her. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of surprise, maybe, that she had dared to ask. "I do not recall," he said. The honesty of it startled her. She had expected dismissal, irritation, a reminder of her place. Instead, he had answered her like she was a person worth answering. "That is not good for you, sire," she said, her voice soft. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, more like the memory of one. "No," he agreed. "It is not." Another silence. Thessaly finished folding the spare blanket at the foot of the bed and turned to leave. "What is your name again?" he asked. "Thessaly, sire." He nodded once. "Thessaly." He said it slowly, like he was tasting the shape of it. "You may come and go as you normally do. You do not need to wait for my absence." It was an invitation. A small one, wrapped in formality, but an invitation nonetheless. Permission to exist in his space, to be visible. Her chest ached. "Thank you, Your Majesty." Over the following weeks, their encounters grew more frequent. Sometimes he was there when she arrived. Sometimes he returned while she was working. They rarely spoke more than a handful of words, but the silence between them evolved. It became warmer, lived in, something she looked forward to with a hunger she did not understand. She learned his rhythms. He slept in fits, 2 hours at most, and often woke gasping. He drank black tea but never coffee. He read by candlelight long past midnight, and the books shifted from military histories to poetry on the nights when the sleeplessness was worst. She found verses left open to pages about solitude and longing, and she pretended she did not notice. He learned hers. The rosemary was replaced by other gifts, small and practical and impossible to explain away as coincidence. A pair of wool-lined gloves appeared by the window during the first cold snap. A tin of salve for her cracked hands. A book of pressed wildflowers with no inscription, left on the chair she sometimes sat in when she thought he was not watching. Neither of them spoke about any of it. One evening, Thessaly was replacing the candles in the wall sconces when the door opened and Cale entered with Brennick Asher, his beta and closest advisor. They were mid-conversation, voices low, and Thessaly did what she always did. She shrank, made herself small against the wall, invisible. But Brennick's gaze swept the room and landed on her with the precision of a man trained to notice everything. "Who is this?" Brennick asked. "Thessaly," Cale said, without looking up from the letter he was opening. "She cleans my chambers." "Since when do you allow servants in your rooms while you are present?" The question was pointed. Thessaly felt it like a blade pressed flat against her throat. Cale glanced up. His expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted. A subtle squaring of the shoulders. A stillness that dared the beta to push the question further. "Since I decided," the king said. Brennick's gaze lingered on Thessaly for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he nodded and returned to the matter at hand. But as Thessaly slipped out of the room, she caught the beta watching her through the narrowing gap in the door. His expression was not hostile. It was calculating. She did not sleep well that night. 3 days later, Thessaly arrived at the king's chambers to find the door already open and voices inside. She paused, listening. Brennick's voice, low and urgent. "The Valemark alliance requires a mating bond, Cale. Lord Sorvain's daughter, Lady Seren, is the strongest candidate. The bloodline is impeccable, and the political advantages are undeniable." A pause. "You cannot rule alone forever," Brennick continued. "The council is pressing for an heir. The border lords need assurance. A strategic mating solves half the problems on your desk." Thessaly stood in the corridor, her cleaning supplies in her arms, and felt something inside her chest crack open like thin ice over deep water. Of course he would mate someone. A noble woman. Someone with a bloodline and a title and a face that belonged beside a king. Not a foundling with chapped hands and lavender under her fingernails. She backed away from the door silently. She set the supplies in the corridor. She walked down the stairs with measured, even steps. She made it all the way to the servants' washroom before her composure broke, and she pressed her forehead against the cold stone wall and wept. She was a fool. A stupid, dreaming fool who had mistaken kindness for something it was never meant to be. That night, she did not leave lavender under his pillow. She left nothing at all. And in the morning, when she returned to clean, there was a single white winter bloom sitting on the windowsill. The rarest flower in Cathara. One that only grew in the king's private garden. Beneath it, in that sharp, angular handwriting, a note that read, "Where did you go?" Thessaly stared at it until her vision blurred. Then she crushed the note in her fist, shoved it into her apron, and cleaned the room without looking at the window again. But she kept the flower. The announcement came 2 weeks later. King Cale Draven would take a mate. Lady Seren Sorvain of the Valemark territories, daughter of Lord Alden Sorvain, heir to the Northern Alliance, a woman of impeccable breeding and formidable political value. The mating ceremony would take place at the autumn equinox, 6 weeks away. The court celebrated. The servants whispered. The kingdom exhaled with collective relief because finally, the king would have a queen. Thessaly heard the news from Odella, who delivered it with the brisk efficiency of someone passing along a weather report. "The Valemark girl arrives next week. Double rotations for cleaning the guest wing. You will help prepare her chambers." "Of course," Thessaly said. Her voice did not crack, her face did not change. She had become very good at keeping her feelings behind her teeth. But that night, lying in her narrow bed, she pressed her face into her pillow and let the grief move through her in silent, shaking waves. She had no right to this pain. He was not hers, had never been hers. A few dried herbs and a pair of gloves did not make a bond. Kindness was not love. Attention was not a promise. And yet her wolf, quiet and dormant her entire life, had begun to stir weeks ago. A restless, pulling sensation beneath her breastbone that sharpened every time she entered his rooms. Every time she caught his scent on the sheets. Every time she found another small gift waiting for her like a confession he could not speak out loud. She told herself it meant nothing. Wolves stirred for all kinds of reasons. She was young and lonely and spending too much time in close quarters with a powerful alpha. It was biology, not fate. She almost believed it. Lady Seren arrived on a gray morning with an entourage of 40. She was everything Thessaly was not. Tall, golden-haired, with cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass and a smile that never quite reached her pale blue eyes. She moved through the halls of Cathara like she already owned them, greeting the court with practiced charm that felt less like warmth and more like strategy. Thessaly watched from behind a pillar as the king greeted his intended in the great hall. Their interaction was formal, polite, and utterly devoid of anything resembling warmth. Cale took her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles in the traditional greeting, and his face was a mask of controlled courtesy. But Thessaly noticed his jaw clench, noticed the way his hand dropped the moment protocol allowed, noticed the way his eyes, just for a fraction of a second, swept the room like he was looking for someone. She stepped further behind the pillar. His gaze passed over her hiding place and moved on. The weeks that followed were the worst of Thessaly's life. She cleaned Lady Seren's chambers now, in addition to the king's. She pressed the woman's gowns, drew her baths, laid out her jewels, and every morning she returned to Cale's rooms and cleaned the space that would soon belong to someone else. The gift stopped. The first morning there was nothing waiting for her. Thessaly stood at the window for a full minute, staring at the empty ledge. Then she turned and cleaned the room with mechanical precision, her movements sharp and efficient, and did not allow herself to think about what the absence meant. He was doing the right thing, pulling away, preparing himself for his mate. She should be grateful. This made it easier. It did not make it easier. On the fourth night without a gift, Thessaly entered the king's chambers to retrieve a tray she had forgotten, and found Cale standing at the window, his forehead pressed against the glass, his hands braced on the frame. He did not hear her come in, or if he did not acknowledge it. She should have turned and left. She should have backed out silently and returned for the tray in the morning. But she could see his reflection in the glass, and his face, unguarded in a way she had never witnessed, was ravaged. The exhaustion was worse than before. The shadows beneath his eyes had deepened into bruises. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor that frightened her. But worse than the physical deterioration was the expression itself. Hollow, lost. The face of a man standing at the edge of something vast and dark and inescapable. "Your Majesty," she whispered. He straightened instantly. The mask slammed back into place so fast it made her flinch. He turned, and his gray-green eyes found hers across the dark room. "You should not be here," he said. "I forgot the tray," she answered, her voice barely holding. Neither of them looked at the tray. "I stopped leaving things," he said abruptly. The words came out rough, like they had been dragged from somewhere deep. "It was not appropriate, you understand." "I understand, Your Majesty. It was never my intention to mislead you." "You did not mislead me, sire." "Good." His voice fractured on the word. Thessaly's throat burned. She wanted to cross the room. wanted to press her hand against his chest and tell him he looked terrible, and ask him when he had last slept, and beg him not to marry a woman who made him clench his jaw every time she touched him. But she was a servant, a foundling, a nobody with lavender under her fingernails, and he was the king, and the distance between them was not measured in feet, but in centuries of blood and tradition. "Good night, Your Majesty," she said. She picked up the tray and walked to the door. Her hand was on the handle when he spoke. "Thessaly." She stopped, but did not turn around. If she turned around, she would break. And she could not break. Not here. Not in front of him. "The lavender," he said, his voice so quiet she almost missed it. "Do not stop leaving it. Please." The please shattered her. She nodded once without turning and left the room. She made it to the stairwell before the tears came. She sat on the cold stone steps in the dark, the tray balanced on her knees, and cried as silently as she knew how. 2 weeks before the mating ceremony, Thessaly made a decision. She could not stay. She could not stand in this castle and watch him bind himself to another woman while her wolf clawed at her ribs every time he walked past. She could not keep cleaning his sheets and smelling his scent and pretending the ache in her chest was nothing. She would leave Cathara, leave the only home she had ever known, disappear into the world beyond the walls and find a life that did not revolve around a man she could never have. She told no one. She packed her things in the dark, a single bag containing everything she owned, which was almost nothing. She left her apron folded on her bed. She left a note for Odella that said only, "I am sorry. Thank you for everything." And she left one last sprig of lavender on the king's pillow. Then, Thessaly Vane walked out of the castle gates at 3 a.m, passed through the sleeping city, crossed the bridge over the Ashwater, and disappeared into the dark. She did not look back. In the morning, King Cale Draven entered his chambers and found the lavender on his pillow. He picked it up, turned it over in his fingers, and frowned. Something felt wrong. Something felt missing. He could not name it, but the air in the room had changed. The warmth that usually lingered here, faint and sweet and inexplicable, was gone. He summoned Brennick. "The servant girl," Cale said, his voice carefully controlled. "Thessaly. Where is she?" Brennick checked. The room was empty. The apron was folded. The note was brief. She was gone. Cale stood in the center of his chambers, holding a sprig of lavender, and felt something inside his chest tear open with a violence that made him stagger. His wolf howled, and the king, who had not lost control of himself since the day he took the throne, slammed his fist into the stone wall beside his desk hard enough to crack the mortar. Cale searched for her. He told himself it was duty. A servant had abandoned her post without permission. There were protocols, questions of security. A woman who had spent 4 years inside the king's private chambers knew things, routines, layouts, vulnerabilities. Her disappearance needed to be investigated. He told himself that for almost a full day before, the lie collapsed under its own weight. On the second morning, he summoned Brennick and gave the order directly. "Find her. I do not care what it takes." Brennick studied him for a long moment. "She is a maid, Cale. She is missing. She left a note. She was not taken. She chose to leave. Find her." The beta's gaze lingered, reading something in the king's face that Cale did not want read. Then Brennick nodded and left without another word. The search lasted weeks. Riders were sent to every village within 3 days of Cathara. Descriptions were circulated. Inquiries were made at every inn, every market town, every border crossing along the Ashwater. Brennick was thorough, methodical, and relentless because whatever he thought of the situation privately, he served his king. They found nothing. Thessaly Vane had walked into the dark and been swallowed by it. No trail, no sightings, no trace. It was as if the world had opened a door for her and then closed it behind her with permanent finality. Cale did not sleep during the search. Not because of his usual restlessness, but because every time he closed his eyes he smelled lavender and his wolf tore at the inside of his chest like an animal trying to claw its way out. He did not cancel the mating ceremony. He should have. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to stop it, to tear up the treaty, to tell Lord Sorvain and his golden daughter and the entire court that he refused. But he was a king, and kings did not rule on instinct. They ruled on duty, on necessity, on the cold calculation of what kept their people alive. The border territories needed the Valemark alliance. The kingdom needed an heir. His council needed stability. And Thessaly was gone. She had made her choice. He would make his. Lady Seren Sorvain became his queen on the autumn equinox, under gray skies and the weight of 1,000 watching eyes. She wore white. He wore black. Their vows were spoken clearly and without hesitation, and when Cale pressed his lips to her knuckles to seal the bond, he felt nothing. No pull, no warmth, no recognition. His wolf went silent for the first time in his life. The marriage was political in every sense. Seren was intelligent, ambitious, and entirely aware that her husband's heart was a locked room she would never be invited into. She did not seem to mind. She had come for power, not love, and Cathara offered power in abundance. They shared a bed. They did not share themselves. Months passed. The kingdom stabilized. The border alliance held. Cale ruled with the same controlled precision he always had, attending councils, reviewing treaties, commanding the loyalty of his generals through competence and quiet authority. But something in him had dimmed. Brennick saw it first. The way the king's attention drifted during meetings, the way his responses came half a beat too late, like a man listening through water. The way he stood at windows and stared at nothing, his hand resting against the glass, his breath fogging the surface. "You need to let this go," Brennick told him one night, standing in the doorway of the king's study. Cale did not look up from the report he was not reading. "Let what go?" "Her." The word landed in the silence like a stone in still water. Cale's pen stopped moving. "The search is over," Brennick continued, his voice careful. "It has been 5 months. She is gone, Cale. Wherever she went, she does not want to be found." "I know." "Then stop looking." Cale set the pen down. His hand was steady, but there was a tremor in his jaw that betrayed him. "I am not looking." Brennick said nothing. Because they both knew the king still sent riders south every 3 weeks, still reviewed border crossing logs personally, still kept her folded apron in the bottom drawer of his desk where no one would find it. "You have a queen," Brennick said quietly. "I know what I have." The beta left. Cale sat alone in his study, the fire burning low, and pressed his thumb against the dried lavender sprig he kept in his breast pocket. He did not let her go. He never let her go. Years passed. 1 became 2. 2 became 4. 4 became 7. The kingdom prospered under Cale's rule, though prosperity came at a cost. He grew harder, colder, more efficient. The warmth that had once surfaced in small, quiet gestures, gifts on windowsills, honey for a cough, a whispered please that broke a servant girl's heart, retreated so far inward that even Brennick could no longer find it. Seren gave him no heir. Their bond, never more than ink on parchment, deteriorated into a mutual arrangement of separate rooms and separate lives. The court whispered. The council pressed. Cale ignored them all. He was a good king, a strong king, a king who kept his people safe and his borders secure. He was also a man who had lost the one soul who had ever made him feel like something other than a weapon, and the wound had never closed. Not once. Not for a single day since she vanished. And then, on a cold morning in late autumn, A messenger arrived at the gates of Cathara bearing a sealed letter. The seal was unfamiliar. Black wax pressed with the image of a white wolf beneath a crescent moon. Brennick brought it to the king's study, his expression carefully neutral. From the Weilheim sovereignty, your majesty, a kingdom in the far north, they are requesting a diplomatic audience. Cale broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The handwriting was elegant, practiced, nothing like the sharp, angular script he remembered. But the name at the bottom stopped his heart. Queen Thessaly of Weilheim. The letter fell from his fingers. Brennick caught it before it hit the floor, read the signature, and went very still. That is not possible, the beta said. Cale stood slowly, his chair scraping back against the stone floor. His hands were shaking. His wolf, silent for 7 years, lifted its head and howled inside his chest with a force that nearly buckled his knees. Prepare the throne room, the king said, his voice barely above a whisper. And tell no one. She arrived 3 days later. The throne room was full. Cale had told Brennick to keep the visit quiet, but word had traveled the way word always did in Cathara, through servants and whispers, and the impossible task of keeping secrets in a castle made of stone and gossip. So the court was assembled. Every noble, every advisor, every general who could manufacture a reason to be present stood along the walls, their curiosity barely contained behind masks of diplomatic composure. Queen Siren sat beside Cale on a smaller throne to his left, her posture perfect, her expression pleasant and utterly unreadable. If she knew anything about the woman who was about to walk through those doors, she gave no sign. Cale gripped the armrests and waited. The doors opened, and there she was, flanked by 12 armored wolves, wearing a crown of black iron and white stone. Walking with the steady, unhurried gait of a woman who had learned to carry power the way other people carried breath. Not the trembling girl who had hidden lavender under his pillow. Not the servant who flinched when someone said her name too loudly. Not the ghost with the dust cloth who had perfected the art of being invisible. This woman was visible. Undeniably, impossibly, devastatingly visible. The court stared. The silence was absolute. Thessaly reached the foot of the throne and stopped. She looked up at him, and Cale felt 7 years collapse into nothing. The bond he had starved, the pull he had tried to bury, roared back to life with such force that his vision darkened at the edges. Her brown eyes met his. They were steady, guarded. And beneath the composure, he saw something she was fighting very hard to hide. Pain. Your Majesty, Thessaly said. Her voice did not waver. I come on behalf of the Weilheim sovereignty to propose a formal alliance. I trust you are willing to hear our terms. Cale opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Brennick stepped forward smoothly, filling the silence. The crown of Cathara welcomes the sovereign of Weilheim. We are honored by your visit, your Majesty. Thessaly inclined her head to the beta, and something flickered in her expression. Recognition. A flash of the girl she had been, standing in this same hall, pressing herself against pillars to avoid being seen. Then it was gone. The formal reception lasted an hour. Thessaly presented her credentials, introduced her advisors, and outlined the purpose of her visit with the composed efficiency of a woman who had done this many times before. A trade agreement, an exchange of resources. Weilheim had mineral wealth and northern timber. Cathara had fertile lowlands and access to southern sea routes. The alliance would benefit both kingdoms. It was all perfectly reasonable, perfectly diplomatic, perfectly hollow. Because beneath the words, beneath the formality, the bond was screaming. Cale felt it in his chest like a fist closing around his heart. Every word she spoke tightened it. Every time her gaze swept past him without lingering, it twisted. She was right there, 10 feet away, close enough to touch. And she was treating him like a stranger. He deserved it. He knew that. But knowing did not stop the pain. When the reception ended, Thessaly was escorted to the guest wing. The court dispersed in a flurry of speculation. Seren excused herself without comment, her expression still perfectly composed, though her blue eyes held a sharpness that suggested she understood more than she would ever say. Cale sat on the throne alone, staring at the empty space where Thessaly had stood. Brennick appeared beside him. "How?" Cale asked, his voice rough. The beta had anticipated the question. "I have already begun inquiries. What we know so far is limited." She crossed the northern border after she left and was taken in by a pack called the Veilheim. Small, isolated, in the far reaches beyond the Greymount Range. Their previous alpha died without an heir roughly 4 years ago. And they chose her? Cale's disbelief was audible. She was chosen, Brennick confirmed. How or why I do not yet know. But their wolves follow her with genuine loyalty. This is not a puppet arrangement. She rules. Cale pressed his hand over his eyes. She was a foundling. No bloodline, no pack. Brennick was quiet for a moment. Apparently, that did not matter to them. The silence stretched. Then Cale dropped his hand and looked at the beta with an expression Brennick had never seen on his king's face. Raw. Desperate. Terrified. "She will not speak to me," Cale said. "She spoke to you just now." "She spoke to the crown. She did not speak to me." Brennick considered this. "Can you blame her?" Cale flinched. Then he stood and walked out of the throne room without another word. That evening, against Brennick's advice, against his own better judgment, against every principle of diplomatic protocol, Cale went to her chambers. The guard at her door was one of her own wolves, a tall woman with silver hair and pale eyes who looked at Cale with polite indifference. "I wish to speak with your queen," Cale said. "Her Majesty is not receiving visitors." "I am not a visitor. I am the king of this castle." The guard's expression did not change. "Her Majesty is not receiving visitors, Your Majesty." He stood there. The king of Cathara, turned away at a door in his own palace by a guard who answered to a woman who had once scrubbed his floors. He should have been angry. He should have asserted his authority. He should have done any number of things that a king in his position would be expected to do. Instead, he leaned forward and said, very quietly, "Tell her I am sorry. Tell her I should have gone after her myself. Tell her the lavender still helps." The guard blinked, a crack in her composure. Small, but unmistakable. "I will pass along your message, Your Majesty," she said. Cale nodded and walked away. Behind the closed door, Thessaly stood with her back against the wood, her hands pressed flat against the grain, her eyes closed. She had heard every word. The tears she had held back since the moment she walked into that throne room finally fell. Thessaly did not sleep that night. She stood at the window of the guest chamber, a room far grander than anything she had occupied in her previous life in this castle, and watched the courtyard below. The same courtyard she had crossed 1,000 times with buckets and brooms. The same flagstones she had scrubbed on her hands and knees. The same walls that had contained her entire world when her entire world had been small enough to fit inside a servant's apron. She was not that girl anymore. She had spent every day since her escape making sure of it. The first year had nearly killed her. She had crossed the northern border with nothing. No money, no connections, no plan beyond the desperate animal need to put as much distance as possible between herself and the man whose scent she could not scrub from her skin. She had been picked up half-frozen by a Veilheim border patrol in the dead of winter, brought to their settlement more out of curiosity than mercy. A lone wolf, packless and starving, wandering the Greymount passes in a threadbare cloak. They should have turned her away. But their elder, a woman named Mareth, had taken one look at Thessaly and gone very still. "This one stays," she had said, and no one had argued. Thessaly had earned her place, not through bloodline, not through politics, through 4 years of work that made her years at Cathara look like leisure. She had learned their language, their customs, their fighting techniques. She had treated their sick with the herbal knowledge she carried from years of work in the castle infirmary. She had settled disputes with a fairness that surprised even herself. And when their alpha had died and the pack had fractured into warring factions, she had been the one to walk into the center of the conflict unarmed and say, "Enough." They had chosen her. Not because she was powerful, because she was steady, because she listened. Because she had walked through loss and come out the other side still standing, still willing to care for people who were not required to care for her back. The crown had never been her ambition, but she wore it now, and she wore it well, and she would not apologize for becoming someone worth seeing. But standing here, in his castle, breathing his air, feeling the bond she had tried to sever thrumming through her chest like a second heartbeat, she felt the old wound open, not the wound of rejection. She had healed from that mostly, the wound beneath it, the foundling's wound, the one that whispered, "You were never enough. You left because you knew it, and nothing you have built will change the fact that he chose someone else." A knock at the door pulled her from the spiral. "Your Majesty." It was Isolde, her silver-haired guard. "The King's Beta has requested a private meeting. On neutral ground. The library." Thessaly hesitated. "Is the king aware?" "The Beta says not." Brennick Asher was waiting in the library when she arrived, standing beside a table stacked with old maps. He looked older, harder around the eyes. But the sharpness was the same, that calculating intelligence that missed nothing. "Your Majesty," Brennick said, inclining his head. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." "You wanted to speak privately," Thessaly said, remaining standing. "Speak." Brennick studied her for a moment, and she saw him recalibrating, adjusting his approach to account for the woman she had become. "The king is unwell," Brennick said. Thessaly's chest tightened, but her expression did not change. "That is not my concern." "It is, actually." Brennick's voice was even, almost gentle. "Because you are the cause." The words landed like a blow she had been bracing for without knowing it. "The mating bond with Seren never took," Brennick continued. "Not truly, it exists on paper, in ceremony, in the eyes of the court. But his wolf never accepted it. You know what that means." She did. An unaccepted bond was a slow poison, the wolf and the man at war with each other, the instinct screaming that the chosen mate was wrong while the conscious mind insisted on duty. It eroded a shifter from the inside, slowly, relentlessly. "He has been declining for years," Brennick said, "sleeping less, eating less. His wolf has gone almost entirely silent. The healers cannot find a physical cause because there is none. The cause walked out of this castle and never came back." Thessaly's hands clenched at her sides. "He made his choice, Brennick. He made a king's choice. That is not the same thing." It felt the same from where I was standing. The Beta was quiet for a moment. "You are right," he said, "and I share the blame. I pushed the alliance. I told him a strategic mating would solve his problems. I was wrong." He paused. "He searched for you. For months. He never stopped. Not really." "Every border report? Every trade caravan?" he asked. Thessaly felt the tears rising and forced them down. She had not crossed a continent and built a kingdom from nothing to stand here and cry in front of the man who had helped engineer her heartbreak. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice controlled. "Because he will die," Brennick said simply. "Not today, not this year. But the decline will continue, and eventually his wolf will give up entirely. And when that happens, you know what follows." She did. A wolf that surrendered was a death sentence. The body followed the spirit into the dark. "What do you want me to do?" Thessaly asked. "Talk to him. Just talk to him. Let him see you. Not the crown, not the diplomat. You. and let him explain what happened and why. Thessaly stared at the beta for a long time. Then she turned and walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame. "He broke my heart, Brennick," she said without turning. "He broke it so thoroughly that I had to build an entirely new life just to survive the damage. And now you are asking me to walk back into the room where it happened and give him the chance to do it again." "Yes," Brennick said. "I am." Thessaly closed her eyes, breathed. Then she left without answering. But the next morning, when a note arrived at the king's study in unfamiliar handwriting requesting a private audience, Cale's hands shook so badly he had to set it down and read it 3 times. The note said simply, "The garden, sunset, come alone." It was unsigned, but it smelled, faintly, impossibly, of lavender. The garden was empty at sunset. The king's private garden, the one behind the eastern wall where no servants were permitted and no courtiers dared trespass. The same garden where the white winter bloom grew. The same garden where a king had once picked a rare flower for a maid and pretended it meant nothing. Cale arrived first. He stood near the stone bench beneath the old ashwood tree, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture rigid with the kind of tension that had nothing to do with authority and everything to do with fear. He had changed out of his formal attire. No crown, no sigils, no armor. Just a dark shirt and trousers and the face of a man who had not slept properly since the night she left. Thessaly came through the garden gate as the last light turned the sky from copper to violet. She had changed, too. The crown was gone. The armored guard was absent. She wore a simple dark dress, her hair loose around her shoulders, and without the trappings of sovereignty she looked, for one aching moment, like the girl who used to tuck lavender under his pillow. They stood 10 feet apart. The same distance as the throne room. But here, without the court watching, without the masks and the titles and the diplomatic language, the distance felt both smaller and impossibly vast. "You came," Cale said. "I almost did not," Thessaly replied. Another silence. The garden was still. No wind, no bird song. Just the two of them, and years of unspoken wreckage between them. "I need to say something," Cale began. "And I need you to hear it before you decide anything." Thessaly folded her arms across her chest. A protective gesture. The foundling's reflex, guarding herself against a blow she expected to come. "When you left," he continued, his voice rough and unsteady, "I told myself you had made your choice, that you wanted to leave, that chasing you would be selfish because I had nothing to offer you except a life in the shadow of a marriage I did not want." His jaw worked. He looked at the ground, at the winter bloom growing along the wall, at anything except her eyes. "But that was a lie I told myself so I could survive the guilt. The truth is, I was afraid. I was afraid that if I went after you, I would have to admit what you were to me. And admitting that meant tearing apart an alliance my kingdom depended on. It meant telling my council and my people that their king had fallen in love with a servant, that the bond I was meant to seal with Seren was a lie, that every decision I had made since the day Brennick put the Valemark Treaty on my desk was wrong." He stopped, swallowed hard. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something barely audible. "I chose the crown over you. I chose duty over the only person who ever made me feel like I was more than a title, and I have paid for that choice every single day since." Thessaly was quiet for a long time. The violet sky deepened toward darkness. Somewhere beyond the garden wall, a torch was lit, casting flickering orange light through the gaps in the stone. "Do you know what the worst part was?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but beneath it, he could hear the fracture lines. "It was not that you chose her. It was that you stopped leaving things on the windowsill. That was how you told me. Not with words, not with honesty, not even with the dignity of a conversation. You just stopped. and I had to stand there and decode your silence like it was a language I was supposed to understand. Cale flinched. I was 20 years old, Thessaly continued, and now her voice was rising, the composure cracking. I had nothing. No family, no name, no pack. The only person in the world who had ever made me feel like I existed was you, and you erased me. You erased me without a single word. I know, he said. You do not know, she shot back, stepping closer. You sat on your throne and made your king's choice, and you had your castle and your crown and your queen to keep you company in the aftermath. I had a frozen road and an empty stomach, and a wolf inside me that howled for you every single night for a year straight. Her eyes were bright with tears she refused to shed. Her hands were shaking. I built a life, Cale. I built a kingdom. I clawed my way from nothing to something, and I did it without you, and I am proud of what I became. But do not stand here and tell me you understand the cost, because you were never the one who paid it. The words hung between them. Cale did not defend himself, did not argue, did not try to explain or justify or soften what she had said. He simply stood there and took it. Every word. Because he owed her that. And then he did something she did not expect. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small dried sprig of lavender, flattened from years of being carried against his chest, faded from purple to gray, so fragile it looked like it might disintegrate at a touch. You left this on my pillow the night you disappeared, he said. I have carried it every day since. Thessaly stared at it, her composure shattered. A sound escaped her, raw and involuntary, somewhere between a gasp and a sob. She pressed her hand over her mouth, but it was too late. The tears came, silent and fierce, streaking down her cheeks in the fading light. I am not asking you to forgive me, Cale said, his own voice breaking. I am not asking you to stay. I am asking you to know that I have never, not for one single day, stopped regretting the choice I made. And if I could go back, if I could stand in that corridor and watch you walk away one more time, I would tear the treaty in half and follow you into the dark. I would choose you. Every time. I would choose you. Thessaly looked at him through her tears. The king of Cathara. The man who had been her whole world when her world was small enough to fit inside a servant's apron. She saw the hollowness in his face, the gray beneath his skin, the way his hands trembled around the lavender like it was the only real thing he had left. He was dying. Brennick had not been exaggerating. She could see it now, up close, without the throne room's distance and formality to soften it. His wolf was fading. The light behind his eyes was dimming. He was a man in the final stages of a slow collapse, held together by duty and stubbornness and a dried flower that should have crumbled to dust years ago. She crossed the distance between them. Her hands found his face. His skin was warm beneath her palms. He closed his eyes at the contact, and a shudder ran through his entire body, violent and involuntary, like a man surfacing after being held underwater for years. I hate you for what you did, Thessaly whispered. I know, he breathed. I love you in spite of it, she said, and I have hated myself for that every day for 7 years. His hands came up to cover hers. His forehead dropped against hers. They stood like that in the darkening garden, foreheads touching, breathing each other in, and the bond that had been screaming since the night she left finally settled into something that did not hurt. What happens now? He asked. I do not know, she admitted. This is not simple. You have a queen. I have a kingdom. We are not the same people we were. No, he agreed. We are not. Thessaly pulled back just enough to look him in the eyes. But I will not run again, she said. And you will not hide behind your crown again. Whatever comes next, we face it. Together. Even if it is messy. even if it is hard, even if the entire world tells us it is impossible. Kale looked at her, at the woman she had become, at the queen who had been a maid, who had been a foundling, who had been the only person brave enough to leave lavender under a king's pillow, and for the first time in 7 years, the tension in his shoulders released. "Together," he said. She took his hand. His fingers closed around hers the way they had wanted to close around hers since the morning he found the rosemary she had tucked into her apron and realized he was in love with a woman who cleaned his floors. They walked out of the garden side by side. Seren accepted the dissolution of the bond with the same pragmatic composure she had brought to every aspect of their marriage. She had never been deceived about the nature of their arrangement, and she departed Cathara with her dignity intact, a generous territorial settlement, and, if the rumors were accurate, a quietly growing connection with a lord in the eastern provinces who had admired her for years. The courts of both kingdoms talked. They talked endlessly. A king dissolving a political marriage for a former servant. A foundling who had become a queen in her own right. A bond that had survived 7 years of separation, an entire continent, and the stubborn pride of two people who had been too afraid to fight for what they wanted until it nearly killed them both. The formal alliance between Cathara and Weilheim was signed on the winter solstice. Not a mating treaty. A partnership between two sovereigns who happened to share a bond that made the air taste like copper whenever they stood too close. The mating ceremony came later. Spring. Thessaly wore a crown of white winter bloom woven through her dark hair. Kale wore black, as he had at his first wedding, but this time, when he took her hand and spoke his vows, his voice cracked on the third line, and he had to stop and breathe before he could continue. The court pretended not to notice. Brennick did not pretend. He stood behind the king's left shoulder and allowed himself a small, satisfied smile that he would deny for the rest of his life. That night, in the chambers that had once been hers to clean and never to occupy, Thessaly lay beside her mate and listened to him breathe. Deep, even, peaceful. No restlessness, no sweat-soaked sheets, no candles burning down to nothing in the dark. On the bedside table sat a small glass vase containing a fresh sprig of lavender. Beside it, a bundle of dried rosemary tied with a strip of leather, so old the leather had gone soft and pale. The first gift he had ever left her. Kept all these years. Thessaly reached out and touched the rosemary with her fingertips. Then she settled back against the warmth of the man beside her, closed her eyes, and slept. The foundling and the king, the maid and the crown. Not a fairy tale. Something harder than that. Something earned.